Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 3rd of November, 2025. Let's get started. Now, they say that money can't buy happiness, but being broke sucks. Life's just better when you got a couple nickels to run together. Am I right? Now, what really sucks is if you're not only broke, but you're in a lot of debt. You owe that money to everybody else, and they're coming for you. Yikes. Which brings us to today's topic, the national debt and America's fiscal health. I know, fun stuff. Now, we've been hearing for years now, since before I was ever even interested in politics, that America's national debt was a huge issue, that one day it was going to crash the entire economy. The fiscal hawks have been screaming and raving about this for forever and a day. And no matter how much debt we seem to take on, it's always going to be the problem that we face tomorrow. Now we're sitting here in the midst of a government shutdown with no end in sight, watching an administration play all sorts of fiscal games to try to mitigate the impact of the shutdown. Congress seems to be unable to act. No idea how much this one's going to cost us. It's not going to be good. Well, how bad do things have to get before the national debt is actually a problem? And in a world of great power competition, do we actually need to worry about the fact that folks like China own a bunch of our debt? That doesn't seem good. Now, why is it that banking in the international system works differently than banking at your own household? To help us dive into some of these topics, I have an awesome guest on today. He is Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum, think tank in D.C. He's got a PhD from Princeton University. He's held numerous positions in and out of government related to economics. In a previous life, he was the director for the Congressional Budget Office. He was also the chief economic policy advisor for John McCain back in the day, for those of you who remember that fine gentleman. And he was also at one point the chief economist of the President's Council of Economic Advisors during the first Bush presidency. Really excited to get his take on what America's financial health looks like, what we actually need to be concerned about, and how we might be able to dig ourselves out of a $38 trillion mess that we're apparently stuck in. And at some point, either we or our children are going to be on the hook for. With that, let's get to Douglas Holtz-Eakin.
Leading a growing business, it's like building a plane while flying it. Team building, decision-making, and scaling all at once. At CPO Playbook, we get it. That's why our podcast, ranked in the top 10% worldwide, tackles the toughest leadership challenges with insights to help you lead smarter and grow faster. Tune into the CPO Playbook podcast because leadership doesn't come with a manual, but we're pretty close.
All right. Well, good morning and welcome to the show, sir. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you on. Excited to have the conversation. Now, real quick, could you introduce yourself in your own words to the audience?
I'm Doug Holtz-Eakin. I'm currently president of the American Action Forum, which is a DC-based think tank that I started in 2010. I have a background as a PhD in economics and have taught for years at Columbia, Princeton, and Syracuse universities. But more recently, spent some time in the government. At the White House, I was chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. I then ran the Congressional Budget Office. I was the domestic and economic policy director for the John McCain presidential campaign, which meant I was unemployed. So then I started the think tank, and here we are.
Yeah, it's funny how that works.
Yeah, I never thought about that, actually. I wasn't really thinking ahead. I had a plan.
So all that background in economic forecasting, and you didn't think through, like, what if the coin flips the other way?
Guilty.
Okay. Fair enough. Even brilliant minds can miss something. Good to know. Real quick thing on the news of the day, though. Got to ask you. So Trump right now is tearing down part or all of the East Wing in order to build a lovely ballroom. And I just want to get your take. Do you think that's the best decision that he's ever made or the best decision any president has ever made?
I have no
idea. In the midst of a government shutdown.
No, I mean, in terms of the PR, I'm not sure the timing's ideal, to say the least. I do think that if it wasn't Donald Trump and someone said the East Wing needs some renovation, you get a lot less fear than this. I mean, it's an old building, and the demands on it are pretty large. So the idea that you might need a larger meeting space doesn't shock me. The way it's been handled, it's just classic Trump. Pick a way to do it that offends the most possible people.
He does have a knack for that, and somehow it keeps working for him. So it's hard to even fault him because look where he's gotten.
Yeah, he's president. I'm not. I know the org chart.
Fair point. Since we are in the midst of a government shutdown, what do you think is driving this shutdown, and how do you think we're ever going to get out of it? Because this seems really weird compared to some of the shutdowns that I remember experiencing when Obama was in charge or some of the other stuff we've gone through. Yeah,
this is driven by the progressive base of the Democratic Party that wanted to, quote, fight Donald Trump. And back in March, when Chuck Schumer agreed to a continuing resolution to fund the government, keep it open, they were extremely displeased and basically said, your job's on the line. And so as we, sort of tipped up to this one, they just made up their mind they were going to shut the government. I thought it would be short. I thought the point was, we're going to show you we have some power. We're going to shut the government. We can air our grievances. But having done that, there would be some recognition that there's no great exit strategy, and they'd get back to business as quickly as possible. I was wrong about that. And now neither side has an exit strategy that I can identify. The Republicans are running right up to the open enrollment deadline of November 1 without renewing the subsidies, which means premiums will be higher and they'll be blamed. Democrats have the government shut. They yesterday chose not to vote to at least pay the essential workers. I think they're going to bear responsibility for that. How anyone gets out of this, I don't know.
What do you think the overall impact on America's fiscal health is going to be? Because you got to imagine rating agencies and everyone else around the world is looking at this, trying to figure out how is the U.S. government so dysfunctional?
So there are a couple of points about that. Number one, every time we have a shutdown, the economics profession goes back and does an autopsy, and you find out it had no real impact on the economy. The last one in 2018 cost us something like $11 billion of GDP. It's a $30 trillion economy. It's nothing. So there's a lot of shifting of things in time, but no outright losses. It costs the government some money. It's cheaper to run the government than to shut it down and restart it. It's something like $2.5–3 billion to just start it back up. So it will put a dent in the numbers. But again, we're running a $2 trillion deficit. That's not a huge dent. And then there's the optics, and that's what the rating agencies are looking at. And we know that when we were first downgraded back in 2011 by S&P Global, the rhetoric was the United States politics are too toxic for it to manage its finances effectively. You get situations like this and debt ceiling showdowns. When Fitch downgraded us, they said essentially the same thing. The process of management is not working. The U.S. has a problem. When Moody's downgraded us most recently, they said, you have too much debt and interest takes up too much of your revenue. And so they weren't talking about the political process. They were talking about the problem being big and unmanageable. To layer a political problem on top of an unmanageable problem seems very bad to me. So I do worry about that.
That's a good point. So we're going away from we have an issue with management in the country to we have an issue with the books of the country.
Yeah, the books are bad now.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Because they weren't great before either.
That's a striking change, in my view.
Okay. We'll get to that more in a second. One other thing about the shutdown I want to pick your brain on, because it impacts a lot of my friends. So previous shutdown, military gets paid. This shutdown, they don't decide to fund the military, but Trump tells Hegseth, go find money. He finds money that we're not quite sure where it came from officially, but looks like it was pulled from a pot that's not allocated to pay the troops. So
Sure.
We have the executive branch seeming to usurp the power of the purse from Congress. That seems like a huge difference between previous shutdowns and a huge red flag for anyone looking at the health of the U.S. government. Do you think there's something to that, or is that just media talking points?
So the anomaly is not this shutdown. It was the previous shutdown where they had actually passed the defense appropriations bill so the troops would be paid, but they didn't pass any of the rest. So it was technically a partial shutdown. The Pentagon was open and running and funded. This is a more typical situation. Everything's shut down. The troops would not be paid. Now, when Congress gives the Pentagon, in this case, money, they often give it transfer authorities along with it. So you can move from this account to that account. I haven't seen anyone say explicitly what accounts were involved and whether there was a transfer authority or not. My suspicion is there wasn't, and that this was essentially done illegally. But nobody has any interest in suing the president and saying don't pay the troops. So they're just letting it slide. That's my instinct on this. There aren't that many places to go for the money. So they're coming up to another pay date. They're not going to have the money. It's going to turn into we're not paying the troops. That's one of the ways this ends. One of the reasons we get shutdowns is they're actually not that painful for the American people. So they're a cheap way to make a political point. But if the air traffic controllers do what they did last time, which is have a nationwide sick out and the planes can't fly, they'll be back. And if you start seeing pictures of military wives in food lines, they'll be back because the optics of that are terrible. And that's what will happen.
Okay. Another thing that's constantly talked about as an important fiscal issue is the deficit that you previously mentioned. I think our current deficit right now was it $2 trillion a year, and our debt is like $37 trillion, something like that.
Yeah, we ran a deficit of $1.8 trillion in the most recent fiscal year, down slightly from the year before.
Okay, I forget who told me this, but it was a great way of describing it. They said that the national debt for Republicans is like what climate change is for Democrats. It's the issue that's always going to end the world tomorrow, and it's been that way for 20 some odd years.
Right.
Is there actually an issue with the deficit? Because it seems like one of the things that's talked about, but hard to point to something where it's actually negatively impacted the American people.
I don't really agree with that because we haven't had the crisis. We haven't had the classic Greece, Portugal, Argentine sovereign debt crisis where interest rates spiked and they go from a measly 4 to 14 overnight, and creditors start saying we want our money, and you get just a really cataclysmic downturn. That hasn't happened, and that's good. No one should want that. But the fact that we haven't had that doesn't mean that we're doing really well. What I usually say is, having the crisis is failing. Not failing is getting a D, and we're getting a D. I think we can do better. And the price we pay is that when we borrow $2 trillion, that $2 trillion is not available to private businesses, individuals, to borrow and do what they want with it. Expand their equipment purchases, put in new software, hire more people, train their people, go to college, take your pick. All of those are things that enhance productivity in the economy, ultimately raise real wages and the standard of living. And so what you give up is some progress. And I think we've given up significant progress. If you look at the period from 1960 to 2000, we had pretty tight fiscal policies. Deficits averaged 2.2% of GDP, and the growth in income per capita was about 2.3% per year, which doesn't mean anything to anyone, but it meant that the standard of living doubled every 29 years. So in one working career, you could be twice as well off, and that's an enormous opportunity for Americans. Since 2000, we have had deficits that averaged well over 5% of GDP, so more than twice as high. Now they're at $2 trillion. They're almost 6% of GDP. And growth rate of income has been a full percentage point slower. 1 percentage point in 1 year, no big deal. Added up over a long time, well, what you get is a standard of living doubling in 56 years, not 29, and the palpable sense of a lot of Americans that they don't have the opportunities their parents had because they don't have the opportunities their parents had. We're growing more slowly. The opportunity to get ahead is harder, and that's a big price to pay in my view. And but it happens a little bit at a time, and no one notices. But if you add it up over 25 years, you get something significant.
So is this something that's just going to continue to be a slow drip, a slow drag in the American quality of life, or does it actually go off a cliff at some point?
It goes off the cliff at some point.
When?
The trouble is we don't know what that point is. There isn't a number that says, here's what it happens. There's a point where our creditors, people who have bought treasuries, lose confidence. It's the ephemeral confidence thing. They lose confidence that the Treasury will be able to repay principal and interest in a timely fashion, at which point they start guarding themselves against that possibility. They ask for higher interest rates. Instead of borrowing at 4 and 5, they say, we want 8 or 9. And that becomes a visible pain on the economy. If they lose a lot of confidence, they cut you off entirely. And that would be a cataclysmic event.
Okay. So why don't we have a balanced budget anymore? I think the last time we ran a budget surplus was like the Clinton years. Why is it that we are just deficit spending every year for decades now, regardless of which political party seems to be in power?
So it's a great question, and I'm not going to answer it, probably, because there's part of it I understand, part that's a mystery. The part I understand is we have this fundamental structural deficit that comes out of the entitlement programs. Social Security was designed for a world in which there were essentially, 8 or 9 workers for every retiree. We're now down to having 3, headed toward 2 workers for every retiree. In a system that requires current workers to pay for the current retirement, we don't have enough workers to bear that burden. And so, we're borrowing the money instead. So Social Security is part of the structural deficit, an important part. Medicare was never designed to stand on its own financial feet. It's responsible by itself for a third of all federal debt outstanding. It has a steady draw in the Treasury. So we've got a big mismatch between revenues and spending in our big entitlement programs. And those 2 programs are more than 1/2 of all non-interest spending all by themselves. Like they are the bulk of the spending over the next 10 years. So there's the structural problem. We knew about this. Everyone could see it coming. We knew the boomers were going to retire. We knew the U.S. was going to have a shift in its demography, yet we did nothing to prepare for it. Bush took a run at Social Security reform in 2004. It failed. He didn't even get a vote in a Republican-controlled House. And since then, there's been no effort made. So we've just let that happen. Second thing that's gone on is there have been big emergencies. We had 9/11, we had the financial crisis, Great Recession, we had a pandemic, and there were big fiscal responses to those things, $5 trillion worth in the pandemic. But we also had emergencies in the 20th century. World War II is a pretty big emergency. And unlike the 20th century, we haven't cleaned up after them. When we borrowed a lot in an emergency in the 20th century, the politics were different than how we went back and ran the debt back down. Yeah. We haven't done that. So we get a structural deficit and layer on top of it big emergency borrowing. Pretty soon you got debt at 100% of GDP. And we started at 30. And that's a big run up in 25 years.
I wanted to ask you about that because it seems like normal politics, we get through the Clinton years, Monica Lewinsky scandal, we all remember. People were already talking about the deficit issue back then. Folks were talking about Social Security. I remember there was a debate when we finally had a surplus and folks were talking about, do you want to put it in a lockbox for Social Security or pay down debt? We were actually having that conversation. We have Bush coming to office, and of course he's a pretty prototypical Republican. We don't want to do nation building. We want to lower taxes, cut costs, yada, yada, yada. 9/11 happens. He puts his I'm a wartime president hat on, and we do World War II style spending to go after folks in caves for 20 years. And it seems like throughout that entire war, Republicans now had permission to spend like crazy. Democrats, they wanted to do it anyway for all the social programs they wanted to fund. And the entire political establishment just got addicted to the idea that we need to spend whatever it takes. There's no limit. We have to get done all these impossible goals. And you can look at the chart of deficit spending and the debt, and it just goes straight up from there. It looks like an exponential curve. So I'm wondering, how much is this national debt issue a hangover from the global war on terror, which seemingly has nothing to do with fiscal or monetary policy?
There's, I think, a heavy element of truth in that. A different way to say roughly the same thing is if there's an old aphorism that budget is policy. If you look at how people spend their money, you identify their values. And if you look at the Bush era budgets, they are basically, we're going to win the war against global terror at all costs. That's the message that comes out of those budgets. Deficits be damned, don't worry about it. But if you look at the Obama era budgets, what they say is, we can afford to do the Affordable Care Act. We can pursue bigger entitlement programs. As long as the rich pay their fair share, we're good. That's the basic message out of Obama era budgets. It's all about the rich foot in the bill, which, of course, Democrats never actually do. Like, they always say that, but they walk right up to it and then don't do it. So now we just have a big debt bill. First time in office, President Trump said nothing about debt deficits. Never in the State of the Union, nothing. And Biden came in with Build Back Better. If you recall, we were going to do paid leaves and free college and childcare and you name it. And it's all good. Just Katie bar the door. So if you're the average American, the most important public educators, the most important policymakers, the people who are supposed to protect you, have not stood in front of you and said the federal budget is a problem. It is an imminent threat to you and your family, and we need to get the deficit down. No, they've said we're good. And so for most people, I think they think we're good. There's no problem. They're blissfully unaware of this. If you ask people to list the pressing policy problems, the deficit comes in sixth at best. It is not on people's radar screen. And I think that's wrong. And I think we can blame presidential leadership in the 21st century. It has not done its job.
So Trump coming in this time around did talk about the deficit a bit. Had this great idea with Doge. Bring on Elon, use AI, get all these smart tech bros in here, clear out all the fraud, waste, and abuse, and that's going to clean up the federal budget. And so we can do a ton of savings and also tons of tax breaks at the same time. That doesn't seem like it's working very well.
It was never going to work because what Doge was looking at was annual discretionary spending, which is only 25% of the budget. As I said, all the money is in checks going to seniors for Medicare and for Social Security, and they were never going to take away the checks. They were claiming they could run the machine more efficiently so they could save some money on personnel. But, we spend at most $400 billion on compensation costs, federal employees. So suppose Doge took out half of them. Well, that's $200 billion, which in the real world is money. But in a $2 trillion deficit, it's not fix the deficit money. And we're not going to get half of them. That's never been in the cards. Mm-hmm. So it was an unrealistic promise. And Doge was never, in my view, going to be a budgetary phenomenon. It's turned out to have no impact at all, really. It's a management issue.
Okay. So one of the cool things with Trump having, a term out of office was that he was able to put together his dream team of allies. Project 2025 was getting written. Theoretically had nothing to do with it. He probably didn't. But he's got all those people surrounding him now. Yep. Was there anything in Project 2025 that was supposed to be the Republican game plan for addressing the deficit when Trump got back into office?
I never thought he would. Because he said the same things that his predecessors said. I'm not going to touch Social Security and Medicare. And indeed, he at one point said, I'm not going to touch Medicaid either, although they did actually do some sort of relatively minor things in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So unless you're willing to do the hard political work of reforming those and make them financially sustainable, you're not serious about deficits.
Okay. Two other spots that I've heard, the Steve Bannons in the world talk about pulling money from to fix this issue. Get your take on this. One is foreign aid overseas, the money we give to Israel, Egypt, all these countries, Qatar, pick a country, any country. And then the other spot is actually the DoD budget itself. And if you want to get serious about balancing the books, you'd have to slash the DoD budget and end all this foreign aid that we're giving to other countries. Do you think there's enough money there to make a difference, or is it only entitlements?
Those are all in that in the 25% that is annual discretionary spending. You get rid of all of it. I mean, so that's $1.8 trillion. Mm-hmm. You just balance the budget, but you have to get rid of all of the Pentagon, all of the foreign aid, all of the domestic agencies, the whole thing. There's not enough money there. It's in the mandatory spending programs, the entitlement programs, and it just I'm a broken record on this, but I mean, it's the old thing. If you want to, why do you rob banks? Well, that's where the money is. Well, if you want to fix the deficit, you got to go where the money is.
All right, well, let me ask you this then. What would we have to do to entitlements to balance the books? What are the options in front of the American people if somebody were to lay them out?
So Social Security is the important one to talk about because the trust fund for Social Security will go bankrupt in 7 years. So the way Social Security works, the payroll taxes come in, they get credited to an account, and then the benefits go out, they debit them from the account, and the accounts there, it's called the trust fund. It's an accounting exercise. For years, we ran surpluses, and the credits built up, and now we're running deficits, and the credits are coming down. 7 years, credits hit zero. At that point, by law, you can only pay benefits with money that's in the trust fund, which means the annual payroll taxes is all that you'll have. That's not enough. So there'll have to be a 25% across-the-board cut in benefits to people in retirement. Now, and I know that's never going to happen. Yeah. So that means that somewhere in the next 7 years, we're going to do entitlement reform. We're going to do Social Security reform. We will have to. And all the people like President Biden, President Trump said, I'm not touching Social Security. Guess what? Game's over. They're touching Social Security because people are going to want them to. Like, instead of going to the town hall and saying, I want to reform Social Security, and you lose your reelection and go work at the Tasty Freeze, you go to the town hall, they say, when are you going to fix Social Security? I want to retire. What am I going to get? And so there's going to be a different momentum there. How do you fix it? Well, you're going to have to get money in the trust fund quickly. So inevitably, there's going to be a Social Security tax increase. Probably the best way to do that is simply raise the cap on taxable earnings back to cover about 90% of wages. That's what it used to cover. Now it's down in the low 80s. So that'll get you some money in. And then you go look at the benefits side and you make the benefits grow more slowly. That's means testing by another name. And there are modest forms of that, and there are aggressive forms of that. The most aggressive form is, well, Social Security is insurance against the possibility that you run out of your economic resources in old age. Not every insurance policy pays off. You don't have a car wreck, your auto doesn't pay off, you don't have a fire, your homeowners doesn't pay off. If you're Elon Musk, do you really have to get a payoff on your insurance? So we could imagine, in the extreme, taking some people off Social Security. Mm-hmm. Or if you keep everyone on, and that's been the Democrats' goal, to make it universal, you have to shave down their benefits much more sharply. And it's doable. It's just a matter of passing the legislation.
Okay, so that almost sounds like a version of tax the rich and also cut their benefits at the same time.
The weird thing, yes, it does.
This sounds like this, like at Bernie Sanders on the Joe Rogan podcast. Like, okay, the math here makes sense.
I mean, that's inevitably where you have to go.
Okay.
Another thing about Social Security is it was designed for a world where you had a pension, personal savings, and Social Security. It was supposed to be one of the legs on a three-legged stool. And we have too many people who have a one-legged stool. That's Social Security or bust. And so the minimum benefit in Social Security is probably too small if you want to believe that people can live on it. So the first thing to do is actually make the problem worse, then fix the rest.
This is so strange hearing this coming from somebody who worked for Republican administrations. It's an interesting world we live in.
This is not what I wanted to do with. I wanted to fix it with when Bush took a run at 2004 because I believed you could do it all on the spending side. Then you could just cut spending, we'd be done. No tax increase. Now we're too close to the exhaustion point, and the benefit changes don't happen quickly enough.
What would you say to some of the folks who are claiming that this AI revolution, which looks like might be a giant bubble in the S&P 500, wipe out the 401ks of the people that do have enough assets theoretically to retire, even without Social Security? Fun concept there with what we've been talking about. What would you say to the claim that with AI coming in, the American worker productivity level is going to go up so much that we will grow our way out of this problem? That's one point on a distribution of outcomes. The probability of that, I think, is well less than one. I'd like to have a plan that's not built on hope, that is built on a useful evaluation of the risks. And there is a risk that doesn't happen. AI looks to me a lot like the wave of innovation that came with information and communication technologies, the PDAs and cell phones and personal computers and networks, and all of that was invented in the 80s. And most of business investment in the 80s went to those things, and we got nothing for it until the 90s. And in the 90s, we saw a pretty big productivity boom, and we had a good run. I'm betting they're spending a lot of money on AI right now and not getting much out of it. They're, you sort of add it to your business, but it's not built into your business model. You don't really benefit from it. But you will. 5-10 years, you'll figure it out. It'll change things. And I hope we do get that. And I hope we get a healthy dose of productivity. But I'd be surprised if it, quickly was a way to take all the problems out of the federal budget and balance the books. Would one way to balance the books be something like an American sovereign wealth fund? We've seen the president actually come in and, they took a 10% stake in, I think it was Intel. Would federal ownership of certain key American companies bring in more revenue?
So,
or enough to balance the books? I mean, more is relative, but
you look at other countries, Norway's, Saudi Arabia's, they have a sovereign wealth fund because they have a problem. They have a surplus that they need to store someplace. Where's our surplus? We don't have one. So our sovereign wealth fund is the U.S. economy. If we have a policy objective we'd like to pursue, we tax people. We take a share of it. We're taking 10% of Intel. It's just a big tax. And we devote it to a policy purpose. That's it. That's what we do. And that's what we should do. There's no reason to tax, put the money in a sovereign wealth fund, and then go spend it on something. I mean, it's just an extra step.
Gotcha. Okay. What about the revenue coming in from tariffs right now? Because I've read a lot of articles saying that the deficit's not as bad as it could be because we have these tariffs collecting revenue, but that's also a drag on the global economy, which reduces overall productivity. So there could be long-term drawdown effects. What do you think the net benefit or net effect of the current tariff regime or whatever tariff regime we're likely to have in place a few years from now? What do you think that's going to do to the American economy?
So I'm not a fan of the tariffs. I mean, they're raising some revenue, about $180 billion. If you put everything in place sort of on a permanent basis, it's $400 billion. Notice that's a fifth of the deficit, so you're still got some problems. It's a really unattractive way to raise a lot of revenue. It's a very distortionary tax. It's a very regressive tax. It's an incredibly hard to comply and administer tax. So if you wanted to raise real money, you should use a tax that's more efficient. We have income taxes that are way more efficient than that. And I think that the downsides on what it's doing for damage in trade are significant, and the headwinds they're providing to the U.S. growth are significant. And on balance, I wouldn't raise the money this way. So I think you solve the deficit not by taxing your way out of it, which is what they're trying to do, but by controlling the spending. In the end, that is the key.
Okay. One of the things that we've seen in the past few years, especially coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, was the fragility of global supply chains, just how vulnerable we are as a country to shortages in goods from places like China. And that's before we even started talking about geopolitical risk and if there was a war or blockade or any of that fun stuff that we now have to consider. And now we're talking about friendshoring and nearshoring, all this great stuff. What steps does America need to take to set up its economy to be able to survive in the era of great power competition? Because the neoliberal consensus around free trade for all, no matter what, seems to be crumbling pretty quickly.
So if you're reliant on semiconductors from Taiwan, you had to have the wake-up call. And I'm surprised it didn't happen sooner. That was like, oh, wait, we have a very undiversified risk sitting out there. We ought to probably think about our supply chains. And if you couldn't get things from China during the pandemic, you as a business have every incentive to fix your supply chains, make them more resilient. It's not a problem for the federal government. The federal government doesn't engineer supply chains. They don't own every business. It's not their problem. Businesses have a genuine financial incentive to have supply chains that will survive shocks and risks because they have customers who are going to want their goods and services in the midst of those shocks. So there are tons of incentives. I'm not worried about that. People took the opportunity of global supply chains to not bear the cost of having inventories in the United States. They may very well have come to the conclusion we need some warehouses. We need to have more stuff in the United States as a buffer against disruptions in shipping. Live and learn. We're seeing a lot of that now. So I think this is a problem that solves itself. I never understood the Biden guys talking about how they were going to fix all the supply chains. They don't have any supply chains. They just have talking points.
Well, two issues that came into sharp relief during the COVID-19 pandemic that come to mind is one, the lack of PPE for healthcare providers. Two was the lack of baby formula. There was, one hypogenic baby formula out there that kids with a certain allergy could take, and we literally ran out of it and we couldn't produce more. That had a very real effect on the immediate lives of the American people, but there doesn't seem to be any sort of private sector incentive to solve for those issues, at least not in a long-term setting. So does the federal government have a role there?
I disagree on the baby food. I mean, it's been it's public policy. We protect our baby food manufacturers. We don't let anyone import baby food, and we could. The FDA could inspect those facilities, and import them, just like we import lots of pharmaceutical components and pharmaceuticals, and they're inspected and they're certified, and we're done. So we're just protecting the baby manufacturers, and we don't do a good job of inspecting the plants, and they had to shut one down, and we ran into the supply shortage. I viewed that as a government failure more than anything else. The PPE, we were supposed to have a national stockpile sufficient to deal with emergencies, and it turns out Congress and the administrations got cheap over the years, and they didn't do it. They didn't fund it. They didn't stockpile it. And then the pandemic hit, and we have nothing. That's a failure because the private sector is not going to do that. There's no reason for them to carry the cost of that stockpile. You do have to have the federal government involved.
Okay. What is it about American politics that makes it seem like our political leaders can't have any sort of long-term thinking about problems like that? And this feels very different than when I was growing up. And it seems like someone like John McCain was one of the last true statesmen that we've had in a position of power in this country. And then post-Obama, Obama at least played the role very well. After that, though, it seems like it's been downhill, and Congress seems like it's been rotting underneath that for a much longer time.
Don't disagree. It's frustrating, this sort of lack of long-term planning. We really haven't seen it. Some people credit it to the demise of the Great Generation, which had lived through World War II, lived through the Korean War, and had a real clear vision of the threats that could face a nation and the necessity of preparing now for things that could happen later. And this generation of leaders just hasn't been through that. I don't know. I don't have an easy explanation for it, but I think we've had relatively low quality presidential leadership for 3 terms now, and that's not good.
Yeah. Well, one could argue that we had a ghost term there in the middle where we're not actually quite sure who the president was.
One can make that argument, yes.
Yeah. Being a little cynical about it, but that was fun to watch.
And I'm really disappointed in Congress right now. They are missing in action.
Yeah.
And that's unforgivable.
Why do you think that is? Because it seems like they have the power of the purse. They should be setting policy. Like they could regulate the executive branch and how they do this, and they've abdicated not only their power to control the purse, but their power to control whether or not we go to war with Venezuela.
This is crazy. What we're doing with the military, I don't understand any of this. Why you announce a covert action in Venezuela, I don't understand. What does it mean to have land strikes in Venezuela? That's declaring war. I don't understand anything that's going on right now.
Yeah, well, it's weird, too, because I was thinking this through. Trump, I was really thinking about it from the deficit point of view because, Trump cut the deal with the Taliban to get us out of Afghanistan. Like it or love it, he didn't end the war, but he hasn't done anything to clean up all the crazy spending from GWAT. And now it looks like we're starting a new conflict in Venezuela, and there's not even a case being made as to why. It's something about fentanyl, but according to the DEA, his own administration, there is no fentanyl coming out of Venezuela. It comes out of China. It gets shipped in component, but it just doesn't make any sense.
Yep, I'm with you. It doesn't make any sense. So, it would be nice if someone other than Rand Paul could stand on the floor of the Senate and say, we should at least know who's on the boat and what they've done before we start striking. Yeah, I agree.
Fair enough. Do you think any of that has something to do with the fact that, special interests are so well funded these days and they can have a huge influence on politics? So, it's always been the case that politicians have been responsive to donors, but they feel so trapped by this well-funded political influence establishment that now exists in D.C. that they have no incentive to actually take mature policy stances.
It's a good question. I don't know. I just won't over-explain. I don't know. I'm disappointed in their performance. Exactly why, I'm not sure.
Okay. Now, one thing you mentioned at the start of this is that you ran the Congressional Budget Office for, I think, what was it, 03 to 04 or 05? Was that it?
5, yeah.
Okay. We hear about this in the news, but what exactly is the Congressional Budget Office, and why is it that Congress itself never likes the numbers you put out?
So the Congressional Budget Office was created by the 74 Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. It was the last law signed by President Nixon before he resigned. And it came out of a fight between Congress and the president on spending money, something we're seeing again. And the Congress sued President Nixon, went to the Supreme Court, and they decided that they were going to, have a better say in financial matters. The administration had the Office of Management and Budget. Congress had nothing, so they decided to have one of their own. So they created the budget committees in the House and Senate, the budget process that you've heard about with budget resolutions and reconciliation and all these things, and they set up the Congressional Budget Office to really do two things. Number one, to tell it that for every piece of legislation that they considered on the floor, what would it do to revenue coming into the Treasury and what would it do to money going out? What would be that's the so-called CBO score on something. And then to produce studies to help them understand policy issues. And CBO produces studies on an enormous variety of topics. And as director, I testified on all sorts of things you might not suspect, like, Iraqi troop rotations and what they were costing us. What was the effective way to call up the reserves, kinetic intercontinental missile interceptors, all sorts of crazy stuff, space-based ones. So, it's an incredibly good resource for the Congress. It gives it analysis that is by law nonpartisan, and it does not make policy recommendations. It's not allowed to. So it answers questions. It doesn't tell Congress what to do. Now, it doesn't always give Congress the answer it would like. And so you always hear people complaining about it. Everything. It would be great if the CBO would say, this is a great project, but they're not allowed to, and they don't say that. And so members are disappointed in them. It would be great if they said, here are the benefits, but actually that's not in their charter either. They don't do benefit cost analysis. They do costs. And so I used to have to explain to members, here's the deal. We do costs. You do benefits. It's your legislation. You're sponsoring it. You tell people why it's worth it. We'll tell them what it costs. And so that's the division. But that puts the onus on them, and they would much rather have someone else do it if they could. And everything they do actually should be free, and it's disappointing when it's not. And, it's also true, literally, that I think CBO serves a very useful psychosocial function of being the dog that Congress gets to kick. So if something goes wrong, you blame CBO and kick it. Fine. I never took that personally. They're just trying to get past this political moment, and so there's a lot of that.
Okay. Another fun topic out there is the BRICS countries. One of the reasons why we can run up such huge deficits is because we are the world's global reserve currency. Yep. At what point does other countries moving to other currencies to conduct bilateral trade, unlikely that I think that we're ever see one become an alternative reserve currency, but even if they just do a significant number of bilateral trade agreements outside of the U.S. dollar, that reduces the demand for dollars, theoretically increases our interest rate.
Yeah.
When does that become a security issue for the United States?
Not yet. I think you've said that correctly, but the BRICS have dedicated themselves to, and BRICS are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa for listeners. Those countries now have a broader range of affiliates as well. They have set up a digital currency that they are going to use for trades among those countries and not use the dollar. That's a one-part economic phenomenon. China would like to displace the dollar as the reserve currency. They said that openly. Seems unlikely to me, but that's part of it. And the other bigger issue is sanctions. We can impose sanctions on Russia because we can control the transactions in dollars through the transactions network known as SWIFT. They don't like that, and they would like to have the transactions being done in something else to allow them to avoid sanctions. So they're trying to do this proactively. I don't think they'll be close to successful. 77% of international transactions are still done in dollars. It's the vast majority, and the dollar figure is bigger than that. But we could undo the attractiveness of the dollar, and that's where I worry about the fiscal situation. So let's not accelerate this process through our own actions. Let's slow it down and take that risk off the table.
Isn't one of the issues with like China using the yuan as a reserve currency that they'd have to produce enough of it to create enough liquidity for other countries to use it, and then also would have to let it float on global currency exchanges, and they lose the ability to control it?
Yes, both. Yes, it's a good thing for the world to have a reserve currency. the dollar or otherwise. Doesn't, I mean, because it reduces the transactions costs for international trade. And so that's a good thing. And the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency is good for us, gives us the ability to borrow more cheaply, but it's not costless. I mean, you do actually have to, it's our dollar, but it's their problem as well. You have to sort of take care of the dollar on behalf of the world.
How does that influence? I mean, assuming a perfect world where, our politicians had mature conversations, how much does the responsibility to understand the impact of our monetary policy on the rest of the world influence the decisions we actually make at home? Because I think the old phrase is like, if the American financial system catches a cold, the rest of the world gets pneumonia, something like that.
I think it doesn't affect the Fed and its conduct of monetary policy at all, because in the end, you want to have a strongly growing economy. That's the employment mandate. You want to have low inflation. That's the price stability mandate, because the dollar exchange rate prices the strength of the U.S. economy. And, that's what you see. The nominal dollar prices inflation. The real exchange rate prices the strength of the U.S. economy. So if it takes care of business at home, it takes care of the dollar. And so it's a byproduct.
How important is it for the Fed to remain independent? This seems like something that's discussed as a sacrosanct principle in financial circles, though the level of independence that's actually written into law somewhat open to interpretation as far as the intent of that independence. We've seen a lot of folks concerned about Trump coming in and trying to stack, I think it's the Board of Governors, is it what it's called?
Yep.
Get rid of one over some shady mortgage deals that seem very not so shady if for anyone who's bought a house. Do you think there's a risk of the independence of the Fed, and how important is that independence really? Because a lot of folks could be concerned, and you especially saw this coming out of every financial crisis like 2008. It seems like you have this unelected board of technocrats making decisions that impact the lives of the American people with no accountability.
So the Constitution lays out clearly that the Congress has the authority to mint coin and to control its value. And so the constitutional authorities are in the Congress. The Congress chose in the Federal Reserve Act to delegate those authorities to a Federal Reserve because they felt they could not conduct them in real time on an effective fashion. I think that's true. So they need to have somebody with a staff and a skill set that knows what it's doing and can operate quickly. That's what they have in the Federal Reserve, and then with a lot of elaboration, but that's really what they did. And they roped the president into this only by allowing him or her to nominate people subject to Senate confirmation to serve on the Federal Reserve. So the president has no business in the Fed at all. It's a constitutional authority given to the Congress. The Congress has delegated with supervision, right? They have to testify. They're subject to the oversight of the Congress. They're not unaccountable. You and I had a conversation earlier about Congress not doing its job. They often have been left unaccountable because Congress hasn't chosen to do the oversight. I don't understand that. But certainly Trump has no business in there. None. And so that's sort of point number one. Point number two is historically, if you look around the world, and people have studied this pretty carefully, the more independent monetary authorities get better outcomes. You get, on average, lower inflation. You get, on average, lower unemployment. You get faster economic growth. Highly politicized monetary authorities do a bad job because they tend to be too short run in their thinking. Let's pump up the economy for the next election, generate a lot of inflation. Oops, jam on the brakes after the election. Then you have a bunch of unemployment. And we've done this in the United States. And the figure most often named in this was Arthur Burns, who was the Fed chairman when Nixon was president, who did exactly that. And if you look back at the record of the United States in the 1970s, it was not good. Consistently high inflation, consistently high unemployment. And part of it was a Fed that was not acting independently. And, the Volcker Fed fixed that. Reagan, told everyone to leave Volcker alone, gave him a lot of independence. That was set the example, and we've had the sort of best monetary performance since then. So it is important, and Trump is over the line. There's no question in my view.
Okay. You mentioned the comparison to other Feds. Well, one unique thing about the American Fed is that it does have a dual mandate for both employment and inflation. How is that different than other reserve banks around the world of another, G7 countries? And how does that impact the decisions that it makes?
So the European Central Bank, the ECB, for example, has an inflation mandate. Its job is to keep inflation at an inflation target. I think there's some real advantages to inflation, single mandate monetary authorities. You can hold them more accountable. You know whether they did their job or they didn't. Right? You hit the target, you didn't hit the target. You can get better performance out of your economy if you keep inflation low on average over time. And if you get better performance, you keep employment growing at the same time. So the outcomes tend to be better with single mandates, in my view. So I think we should go to that, but we haven't. A downside to the single mandate, the inflation mandate, especially, is you're saying to the public, we care about inflation. Mm-hmm. They're like, well, wait a minute. What about my job? Right? So it might be harder in our democracy to continue to get support for the Fed if it looks like it doesn't care about people being unemployed. That's a real issue that I acknowledge, but we have a dual mandate. The ECB has a single mandate. There are other ones that do inflation first, and then secondarily, if you got inflation, you're going to make sure employment keeps growing. So they sort of stack the priorities. There are lots of flavors of these things. What's unique about ours is this dual mandate. We don't know at any point in time how much weight any individual on the board of governors is putting on inflation versus unemployment. Like right now, both are an issue. How is inflation twice as important as unemployment? The vice versa? Are they even? I don't know. So it's hard to figure out why they're making the decision they're making. Is it because of the data or their values or both?
Are they required to publish their reasoning for decisions once they make them?
Yes. Yeah, they put out the minutes of the Federal Open Market Committee. We read them like the criminologists used to read everything that came out of the Soviet Union. It's like, can we figure out what's going on? The answer is no.
Okay. So they got to put something out, but nothing tells them what has to be in it.
But they used to have books about the Fed called like The Secrets of the Temple. They were completely non-transparent. Like they didn't publish the minutes. You just had to guess what was going on. So now we publish minutes. They publish with their forecasts. The chairman holds press conferences, explains their reasoning. It's a big step in the right direction.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned before was when we cut Russia off from the SWIFT banking system, right, as punishment for invading Ukraine. One might argue that that's not much of a punishment, but an interesting thing that we've seen relative to the crime, interesting thing that we've seen, though, is that Russia's GDP has actually grown since they've been cut off from the SWIFT banking system. And I wonder to what extent America relies on its economic muscle to conduct foreign policy, and are we sacrificing that muscle on the altar of political expediency here at home, losing one of our most powerful tools of national security?
Maybe, I thought, the taking of Crimea with essentially no consequence was the starting point for this. And the response was sanctions that didn't have any real teeth. And so that undercuts the value of sanctions and it undercuts the value of every other response. That was the moment to rally the Western world to the threat. Mm-hmm. And I think a fair concern right now is, why are we messing with Venezuela when Russia has openly decided to see what it can do in Poland, what it can do in Denmark? I mean, we're seeing intrusions across Europe. I would be nervous about that. And I would be focusing on the Russian threat in Europe. It seems like a bigger threat than these boats, but
yeah,
that's me.
Do you think that foreign policy, what role do you see foreign policy and security interests of the United States play in how we pursue fiscal and monetary policy here at home, beyond just, hey, we want to go to war in Iraq, let's spend a bunch of money and juice up Raytheon stock price?
That's not the bigger. I think, what the Pentagon has said repeatedly is that the debt is a national security issue because it opens us up to financial threats that don't have to be there. interest rate spikes that damage the economy and thus hurt the ability to, prepare for national security events and to build a strong national defense. If you take care of business, then you don't have that weakness, and they'd be much happier. I think there are good reasons to do that.
Okay. Do you see other countries ever doing any sort of economic manipulation in order to coerce or punish the United States? Is there a way with our integrated trade system and integrated banking system, is there a way for hostile actors to actually have negative impacts on us here at home?
So, yes, but they're not costless. I mean, there was a concern this passed so much because China has stopped holding so much treasury debt. They diversified away from the United States to a great extent. Japan is now the largest holder of overseas holder of treasuries. But you can imagine dumping all your treasuries, like just selling them in a day. Fire sale on treasuries means interest rates skyrocket. And
didn't Japan threaten to do that after the latest round of tariffs that Trump put on? I'm trying to remember. I think their prime minister went back home and had some fire and brimstone speech in front of their parliament.
But he lost his job, so that's a completely different. The fallout of cutting a deal with Trump was very bad in Japan. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But people worried about that. But you have to blow up your balance sheet to do that, right? You take your valuable assets and you fire sale them. So there's damage to the country that's going to do it is the point. That's always seemed to hold it in check.
Well, I'm thinking about a country like China with the centralized control economy. And one of the interesting things looking at them is that, our stock price over the past several decades, S&P 500, skyrocketing through the roof, even though the real economy has flatlined by some measures or has grown very slowly by comparison. We talked about that a little bit earlier. China, their stock market has been flat essentially for decades, but their real economy, their quality of living has gone up drastically. So for a country like them, they don't really seem to care about their balance sheet. So couldn't they use that as actually an effective weapon with really no domestic consequence?
Well, probably don't know, but I mean, that was the concern. But they've chosen to get rid of dollars instead. And so they're not putting themselves in a position to do that anymore.
Okay. If you could sit down with Trump, because I know we're getting close on time here, but if you could sit down with Trump and grab him by the ears and tell him, like, hey, dude, you need to do X, Y, Z to fix this economy, and he'd actually listen to you, what would you be telling him?
I think he, like many businessmen, confused their roles. He's not running the U.S. economy. He's setting the rules by which other people run their companies in the U.S. economy, and he doesn't need to be micromanaging decisions made by Nippon Steel. I don't understand why we've got the golden share and why he's telling them he has to keep a plant open that's not economic anymore. I don't see what a 10% stake in Intel is going to get him. So that's a big distinction. And I've known a lot of businessmen come into the federal government and they're used to running everything and they want to just go in and touch everything. And that actually backfires because it tilts the competitive scale. If you touch one company, that's not fair to the others. Once you put money into something, they never let it fail. If Intel does bad, pour more money in. Our political process is terrible at saying, nope, we're not doing that anymore. So that's a big line that he's crossed that I wish he wouldn't cross. And now I would fix that. And then I would tell him to sort of pay more attention to the books of the federal government. That is the best gift he could leave in the long term. Ballrooms are nice, trade deals are nice, but they're ephemeral by comparison. So fix the books, take care of the next generations. Okay.
Well, and here's a fun thought experiment for you too. Let's say that you're now a senator in the United States Congress. You're sitting down at lunch. What?
Don't you threaten me.
You get great health care. No, so you're senator of the United States Congress. You got McCain's old job. It's great.
Yeah.
Okay, you're sitting down at lunch with Bernie Sanders. The two of you are co-sponsoring a piece of legislation that you got in front of you. What piece of legislation would you co-sponsor with someone like Bernie Sanders from across the aisle to come together and try to take a step to fix the American economy?
We would reform and reprivatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They shouldn't be on the government's books. It's been 17 years since they're put in conservatorship. It's an outrage. And they are large duopoly that needs to be fundamentally restructured so that we have a competitive secondary market for mortgages. And he and I could do that.
Okay. Well, awesome. Hey, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. This has been fun. Please come back on sometime, and thank you again. Anything else you want to leave with the audience before we go?
No, thanks for the chance to be. This is a great pleasure. Appreciate it.
No, all right, likewise. All right, let's wrap this.